The training world Threx 12 had a way of overwhelming even the most disciplined cadets the moment a squad stepped onto its soil. The air itself seemed heavier, saturated with the mineral dust carried by the constant winds that scraped along the cliffs and carved the landscape into deep, jagged wounds. The alien students had been warned that the environment would challenge every assumption they had about field navigation, but none of them expected the path to end so abruptly before a canyon that looked as if the planet had been split apart by a deliberate strike. The squad stopped at the edge, stunned into silence, the warm colors of the rocky terrain turning colder the longer they stared across the void. The canyon stretched farther than any of the cadets could see from their position. It was not merely deep, it was impossibly vast, as if the ground had collapsed to reveal a piece of open space in the middle of the world. Wind roared upward from the abyss with such strength that it made loose dust swirl around their feet. The drop below was invisible under the shifting haze, which only increased the sense of danger. The cliffs on both sides were sharp and crumbling, with broken outcrops jutting like crude fangs. The instructors had removed hover belts, scanners, mapping drones, and every form of tactical climbing gear before the squad even entered the zone. The cadets were supposed to rely on observation, teamwork, and problem-solving, but this gap looked far beyond the reach of any logic. The squad's captain, a tall alien cadet named Sereth, approached the cliff's edge with slow, tense steps. She squinted, hoping for any sign of a natural crossing. The sunlight reflected off the opposite ridge, revealing nothing except an equally steep cliff and the faint outline of a path that continued from the edge on her side, as if the designers of the test intended for the squad to step directly into the void. Her throat tightened when she imagined the instructor's silent satisfaction at watching the squad's hesitation. She glanced back at her team, hoping for reassurance, but every face carried the same paralyzing doubt. One cadet, a younger alien named Lauren, dared to step closer to Sereth to peer into the canyon with her. He instantly regretted it. The moment he leaned just slightly forward, a piece of the cliff crumbled away beneath his boots and fell into the abyss without a single sound. The missing sound was worse than a roar. It meant the canyon was too deep for an echo to return. Lauren froze, his limbs stiffening in pure instinctive terror. Sereth grabbed his arm to steady him and pulled him back, but he remained rigid, staring wide-eyed at the place where the cliff had broken. The rest of the squad stepped back in unison, each student suddenly aware that even a breath too close to the edge might send the stone downward. Panic began spreading through the group like a silent infection. A second cadet clutched her own arms tightly as a tremor ran through her shoulders. She looked from the canyon to the tree line behind them and back again, as if hoping the terrain would magically rearrange itself into something less threatening. Her breathing rose into shallow gasps, and soon she was no longer thinking about the objective or the time limit. She was thinking only of the endless emptiness below. Sereth tried to speak, but her voice failed her before she managed a sensible word. Farther from the edge, Alex Ward watched the squad from a calm distance. The human cadet had stayed a few steps behind the group by choice, not fear. He had already sensed the shift in the terrain long before the others reached the edge, and he understood that rushing toward any canyon without awareness was a dangerous habit. While the aliens fixated on the drop, he focused on the unstable rock under their feet. His boots pressed into the dirt with careful precision, and his eyes drifted along the edges of the cliff, tracing the cracked patterns in the stone. He did not need to look into the abyss to understand the threat. He could feel its presence through the ground. Sereth finally found her voice, although it cracked under the pressure. She pointed toward the opposite side and tried to sound authoritative, but she failed to mask the dread in her tone. The path they were supposed to reach continued across the canyon, illuminated by streaks of glowing moss that clung to the rock. It was undeniably part of the route. The instructors had planned for the squad to reach it. That could only mean one thing. The canyon was meant to be crossed somehow, and the squad had to figure out how to do it without relying on technology. Lauren shook his head rapidly, the panic tightening around him like a physical grip. He muttered that no one could cross something so wide without equipment, that the test was set up to ensure failure. Another cadet suggested that perhaps the instructors expected the team to turn back and search for a hidden passage, but no one dared step away from the edge to confirm this theory. The canyon had drained their confidence so quickly that even retreat felt dangerous. A few began blaming the instructors outright, accusing them of designing a challenge that bordered on cruelty. Others blamed Sereth for leading them too close to the edge without checking the terrain ahead of time. Within minutes, the group that had marched in with discipline now stood fractured and trembling. Alex continued to observe silently, but not with detachment. He understood the nature of fear and how it distorted judgment. He watched each cadet's reaction with precise attention. He saw how Sereth tried to maintain control but struggled with her own anxiety. He saw how Lauren avoided eye contact, still shaken by the crumbling cliff. He saw how another cadet covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed by the thought of failure. He was not immune to the canyon's severity, but he processed fear differently. The human mind had been shaped by environments just as unforgiving as this one, and Alex had learned through countless past scenarios that when panic spread through a group, the first step was not action. It was understanding. He took a slow step toward the tree line, letting the others continue their frantic attempts to argue or reason through the situation. The sound of the wind intensified as he moved farther from the canyon and closer to the dense vegetation that bordered the path. The leaves rustled overhead, long and flexible from the high atmospheric moisture of Threx 12. Something about their movement caught his attention. He reached out and touched one of the vines draping from a low branch. The texture was rough, almost fibrous, and the vine felt strong enough to support weight even under strain. A quiet idea began forming in his mind, not yet solid but promising. His instincts sharpened as he tugged lightly on the vine to test its flexibility. The material resisted without snapping, bending with a smooth, sturdy motion that reminded him of ropes used in mountain training on Earth. He did not smile, but the faint shift in his expression showed that he had found something important. The aliens were staring into the canyon in despair, but Alex saw a forest filled with possibilities. Behind him, the arguments grew louder, even though none of the cadets moved any closer to solving the challenge. It was the kind of fear-driven noise that never produced solutions. Alex let their voices fade into the background as he continued testing the vines, studying their length and durability. The canyon was vast, but so were the resources around them. He understood that the solution, if one existed, would not come from staring into the abyss. It would come from understanding the terrain that surrounded it. Without saying a word, he wrapped the vine around his arm to carry it back toward the group, ready to examine the cliff structure more closely. The wind still roared over the canyon, but something had shifted. The fear remained, but now there was also the faintest possibility of crossing, a possibility only Alex seemed able to see at that moment. The chapter of panic was ending, and a new one, silently shaped by the human's observation, was beginning. Sereth tried to steady her breathing, but each gust of canyon wind made her nerves contract again. The roar from the abyss drowned out every attempt at rational thought. She kept glancing at the vine Alex had brought back, unsure whether it represented hope or another dangerous risk. Her squad stood in disorganized clusters, no longer aligned in formation. The sense of unity that had accompanied them through the earlier parts of the trial had evaporated the moment the cliff revealed its cruelty. Each cadet now faced the canyon not as a team member, but as an individual trapped in fear. Lauren sat on the ground several steps away from the edge, his back pressed against a twisted tree root. His hands trembled with a rhythm he could not control, and he stared at the vine Alex carried as if it were a venomous creature instead of a potential tool. His mind replayed the moment the cliff crumbled beneath him, amplifying the terror until his thoughts blurred. He muttered quietly, insisting that the canyon was designed to eliminate the squad rather than test it. No one challenged him. Even Sereth lacked the certainty to dismiss his belief. Another cadet, A tall reptilian student named Vera paced in short, agitated bursts. Her scales rose and fell in agitated waves along her arms each time her gaze drifted toward the abyss. She had been raised on a planet where deep fissures were associated with ancient predators that dragged victims into the earth. Even though she knew Threx 12 had no such creatures, the instinctive fear remained. She kept pressing her palms together, forcing herself to breathe slowly, but every attempt failed. The wind mocked her with each hollow scream from below, making her feel as though the canyon itself was calling her name. A fourth cadet, Shira, tried to remain logical. She stood with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed as she studied the opposite ridge. But even her analytical approach faltered whenever the ground shifted slightly under her feet. She had noticed Alex examining the vines, and although she respected his calmness, she could not understand how he remained so composed. She assumed he was pretending for the sake of the group, but the steadiness of his eyes revealed something else, something she had never seen in a fellow cadet from any species. Her confusion mixed with frustration, worsening the anxiety spreading through her. Alex ignored the spiraling panic around him. He knelt beside a cluster of rocks and placed the vine on the ground, straightening it out to evaluate its length. His hands moved with precision, each motion deliberate. The vine was long but not long enough. He would need several, and he would need to braid them together to create a rope strong enough to support multiple bodies. His attention drifted to the cliffs again, this time not to judge the danger, but to identify secure anchor points. Two protruding rock formations caught his eye, one on the squad's side, one directly across. Both looked stable, though the one on the opposite ridge would require a precarious approach if he wanted to wrap anything around it. Sareth watched him closely. She admired his focus, but it also unnerved her. She approached with cautious steps, afraid of both the canyon and the possibility that Alex's idea might not work. Her voice wavered when she finally spoke, asking whether he believed a rope could hold against the canyon winds. Alex examined another vine and gave a quiet answer, explaining that the wind strength was inconsistent and that timing would matter as much as the materials. His tone was calm, but not dismissive. Sareth nodded slowly, but the uncertainty remained firmly embedded in her mind. Behind her, panic began building toward a collapse. Vera's pacing grew frantic as she failed to control her instincts. Shira attempted to speak to her, but Vera flinched away, convinced that any step closer to the canyon increased her chances of falling. Lauren covered his ears with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the sensation that the abyss was somehow expanding, pulling the ground toward itself. The emotional spiral deepened, and the squad shifted dangerously from fear into near hysteria. Sareth tried to intervene, but her words were swallowed by the wind. She called out louder, but Vera barely registered the sound. Shira attempted to stop Vera's erratic movement, but Vera jerked away and nearly stumbled toward the cliff edge, forcing Shira to grab her arm to pull her back. The moment Shira touched her, Vera panicked even more, convinced she was being dragged toward danger. A shout escaped her, sharp and frantic. Lauren flinched at the noise, his anxiety growing into full-blown panic. Alex finally looked up, his expression tightening as he assessed the rising chaos. He approached slowly, knowing that rushing toward terrified cadets would only worsen their reaction. Sareth stepped aside to let him through, silently relieved that someone in the squad still maintained clarity. He faced Vera, who was breathing rapidly, her eyes darting from his face to the canyon behind him. She stepped backward, but her heel hit a loose stone, causing her balance to falter. Alex reached out, not aggressively but with calm precision, and steadied her by the wrist before she could lose her footing. His grip was firm but gentle. Vera exhaled shakily, not yet trusting him but desperate for something that felt stable. Alex guided her away from the edge with steady steps until she stood near the tree line. Shira assisted, her movements careful, as if she were afraid of breaking a fragile object. Sareth hurried to Lauren next. She knelt in front of him, placing her hand on his shoulder, reminding him to breathe. Her voice softened, carrying a tone she rarely used. She explained that he was safe where he sat, that no one was going to force him near the edge again. His breathing eased fractionally, though he still shook with each exhale. Sareth stayed with him, unwilling to move until his panic lessened. Alex stepped away from the group once Vera was stable. He retrieved the vine and walked toward the forest again. The cadets watched him, their breathing uneven, their nerves frayed. None of them spoke. They simply observed the human cadet disappearing between the trees, returning only minutes later with several more vines coiled around his arm. His confidence brought a strange contrast to the surrounding fear, but it also planted a seed of disbelief among the squad, disbelief that he would even attempt something so ambitious. Shira approached him reluctantly. She asked whether he had actually formed a plan or whether he was improvising under pressure. Alex answered that he had a plan forming, but it needed confirmation from the terrain. His calm tone made Shira pause. She realized he meant every word, and that realization unsettled her more than the canyon itself. He was not simply reacting, he was strategizing. Sareth finally stood up, leaving Lauren to breathe on his own. She approached Alex with determination rising beneath her nervousness. She demanded to know whether his idea was safe. Alex looked at the vine in his hands, then at the canyon, and finally at her. He admitted that nothing on a world like Threx 12 was entirely safe, but he also explained that standing still in fear was far more dangerous than attempting a solution. His honesty shook her, but it also grounded her. Vera moved closer, still trembling, but calmer than before. She asked in a weak voice whether he would really try to build something that could carry the entire squad. Alex did not hesitate. He said yes. The simplicity of his answer stunned her. The panic did not vanish, but it shifted. Instead of spiraling uncontrollably, it condensed into a sharp, silent tension. Each cadet looked at Alex with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The canyon was still a monstrous obstacle. The fear still clung to their thoughts like a cold fog. But now, for the first time since reaching the edge, they were no longer frozen. Their fear had not disappeared, but it had been interrupted by something stronger, curiosity about what the human intended to build. And that curiosity pulled the squad back from the edge more effectively than any command Sareth could have given. Alex carried the bundle of vines toward the clearing without waiting for encouragement. The squad watched him from a distance, still shaken, but calmer now that panic had stopped escalating. The wind had not grown gentler, but the cadets' fear had settled into a tense stillness. Sareth stood closest to him, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on his hands as he dropped the vines onto the ground and knelt beside them. She did not speak at first, unsure of how to even begin a conversation after the emotional chaos that had overtaken her squad. But Alex did not need instructions or reassurance. He began organizing the vines immediately, separating thicker strands from thinner ones with a quiet focus that drew attention like a gravitational pull. He picked up one of the thickest vines and stretched it between his hands, testing its elasticity. It resisted his pull with a slow, strong flex. Satisfied, he anchor-wrapped one end around a nearby boulder, pulling until the vine tightened. The bark creaked under the tension, but the vine did not fray. Sareth observed his actions with growing interest, each movement revealing a piece of logic she wished she understood more clearly. Alex glanced at her only briefly before returning his attention to the vines. He encouraged her with a simple nod to come closer. She hesitated but moved toward him until she could see every detail of his hands. He demonstrated the process by folding two vines together, aligning them so the fibers overlapped in a subtle diagonal pattern. His fingers moved steadily, twisting the pair into a thicker rope. The friction between the vines produced a faint sound, like distant whispering. Sareth watched his technique carefully, realizing that he was not merely tying vines together. He was merging them to multiply their strength. His motions were rhythmic, almost meditative, grounding her more effectively than any attempt to speak. She lowered herself to sit beside him and offered to hold one end while he twisted the other. He accepted her help without hesitation. Vera approached cautiously, still trembling but no longer in a state of collapse. She watched from behind Sereth, her eyes following each twist of Alex's hands. Shira stood farther away, arms folded but no longer in analytical detachment. Instead, she stared as if trying to absorb every decision Alex made. The cadets might not have fully trusted his plan, but the logic in his movements evoked something familiar. The instinct to follow someone who understood what needed to be done. Once the first rope reached the thickness Alex needed, he held it up, showing its new stability. It was imperfect and rough, but undeniably strong. He gave it a sharp pull to demonstrate. The vine rope held against his full strength. Sereth flinched at the sudden motion, but when she saw that nothing snapped, she exhaled a breath she had unknowingly been holding. Alex handed the rope to her and instructed her to test it herself. She pulled tentatively at first, then harder, and then with the full force of her arms. The rope remained firm. Lauren, who had been sitting in the shade of a low branch to calm himself, finally gathered the courage to stand. He approached the group slowly, unsure if he would be useful or simply in the way. Alex noticed him immediately and gestured for him to join. Lauren swallowed the fear trapped in his throat and stepped forward. When Alex handed him a piece of vine and instructed him on how to strip away loose outer fibers, Lauren accepted it with cautious hands. His breathing steadied as he focused on the tactile work. The repetitive motions helped quiet his mind, replacing flashes of panic with something smaller and manageable. Alex worked beside the cadets, braiding and reinforcing the vines with a precision that came from experience rather than confidence alone. He did not rush. He allowed the group to follow his rhythm, growing steadier with each completed section. The rope expanded steadily, becoming long enough to reach across the canyon once fully assembled. But Alex knew one rope would never be enough to carry an entire squad. He needed multiple lines, each reinforced and anchored properly. He tasked Sereth and Shira with gathering more vines from the forest. He directed Vera and Lauren to return with fallen branches that had not rotted, explaining that these branches would serve as structural stabilizers once the bridge began to form. The cadets listened more attentively this time, no longer lost in panic. Sereth led the group into the tree line with a renewed sense of purpose, her earlier fear replaced by a frantic but determined energy. She moved quickly, scanning for the right materials, tearing down vines with her claws and carrying back as many as she could manage. Alex remained in the clearing, braiding and twisting the vines into increasingly stronger cables. The motions warmed his muscles, but the real effort came from calculating the geometry of the bridge in his mind. He pictured how the ropes would anchor, how the tension would distribute, and how the wind would affect each part of the structure. His hands moved without pause, pairing one vine with another, weaving them until his fingers throbbed. He ignored the discomfort. He focused only on the work. Shira returned with an armful of vines and placed them beside him. She asked cautiously whether the bridge would sway dangerously. Alex replied that any rope bridge would sway, but a well-balanced structure would hold as long as the cadets crossed one at a time and moved steadily. Shira nodded, although her eyes betrayed her lingering worry. Vera arrived next, carrying several long branches on her shoulder. Her breathing was heavy, but her posture held more stability than before. She placed the branches in a small pile and stepped back, watching Alex evaluate them. He selected the strongest ones immediately and began tying smaller ropes around them, explaining that the branches would become the lateral supports to prevent the walkway from collapsing inward. As the cadets gathered more materials, the clearing transformed into an improvised workshop. Vines coiled in piles, branches lay neatly organized, and the braided ropes grew longer and thicker with each passing minute. Lauren returned with a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, the first sign of relief since he had fallen into panic earlier. He watched Alex assemble a knot pattern at the end of one rope and asked whether he could learn it. Alex nodded and demonstrated the steps slowly. Lauren imitated the motions until his hands stopped fumbling and the knot formed correctly. He straightened, pride replacing his fear. Sareth eventually returned, carrying a heavy load of vines draped over her arm. She dropped them beside Alex and knelt with visible exhaustion. She asked quietly how many ropes he believed they needed before attempting the bridge. Alex gestured toward the canyon's width and answered that the number depended on the stability of the anchor points. She nodded, understanding that the task was far more complex than it looked. As the sun lowered slightly in the sky, the team completed enough ropes to begin assembling the structure. Alex examined the cliff again, identifying the exact point where the first anchor would need to be placed. It was a rough protrusion of stone, thick enough to support tension, but dangerously close to the unstable edge. Sareth watched him measure the distance with his eyes, her heart tightening with nervous anticipation. Before anyone could question him, Alex lifted the first rope onto his shoulder and began walking toward the canyon's edge. The cadets followed him instinctively, forming a loose semicircle behind him. Their fear had not vanished, but now it stood beside something stronger, the belief that if Alex trusted his own plan enough to approach the abyss, then perhaps the plan was worth trusting as well. The wind rushed upward again, lifting dust around his boots as he stopped at the very edge. He looked down only briefly before focusing on the anchor point. His hands tightened around the rope. Behind him, the cadets fell silent, watching with a tension that bordered on reverence. The human was ready to begin the structure that would determine whether the squad survived the trial or failed it. And for the first time since reaching the canyon, every cadet felt that possibility shifting toward survival. Alex stood at the cliff's edge with the first rope resting across his shoulder, the weight firm but manageable. The wind pushed against him in unpredictable bursts, yet he remained steady, measuring the rhythm of each gust before taking a single step closer to the anchor point. Sareth watched him with a mixture of dread and trust that made her chest tighten. She had never seen someone treat danger as if it were simply another tool to interpret. Alex did not hesitate. He lowered himself carefully, securing one foot against a stable rock ledge, then braced the rope under his arm as he leaned toward the protruding formation that would serve as the anchor. His fingers searched for solid crevices along the stone, mapping out the best place to tie the first line. Once he found the right hold, he wrapped the rope 3 times around the thick stone edge. He tightened each loop with his entire body weight, pulling until the fibers compressed against the rock. The rope thrummed in the wind but remained secure. He then tied a reinforced knot, one that interlocked with itself twice for stability. When he stepped back, he gave the rope 2 powerful tugs. It held. The cadets behind him exhaled collectively, the sound rising above the wind for the first time since they arrived at the canyon. Sareth knelt beside the rope to examine his work, her hands tracing the tension under the vine fibers. She noted how the strands locked together, how the weight distributed evenly. She asked him whether the opposite side had a similar anchor point. Alex pointed toward a jagged outcrop on the far ridge. It was narrower but angled in a way that would grip the rope if secured properly. The challenge was reaching it. Sareth swallowed nervously, realizing that someone would need to cross first. She assumed Alex intended to take the risk, and her pulse quickened at the thought. Before she could speak, he stepped back to gather the second and third ropes, each braided earlier into thick, reinforced lines. The cadets helped him lift them, and together they laid the ropes parallel to the first, forming the skeletal beginning of what would become a bridge. Alex instructed Vera and Lauren to hold the ends while he tied additional knots along the primary line, creating sections to which the stabilizing branches would attach. When he finished the main ties, he retrieved the longest branch from the pile. He lifted it horizontally and aligned it across the ropes, then tied the ends to the primary and secondary lines. Sareth assisted with tightening the knots, her movements much steadier now than earlier. The branch created the first step of the walkway. Once it was secured, Alex added 2 more shorter branches to reinforce the stability. Shira watched the structure grow with growing astonishment. In less than an hour, the rope and wooden frame resembled the beginnings of a genuine suspension bridge. Alex paused only long enough to evaluate the weather. The wind had grown slightly stronger but remained manageable. The sun had shifted enough for shadows to stretch across the canyon, indicating that time was slipping faster than he wanted. He continued building with renewed urgency. The cadets worked beside him, passing vines, tightening knots, securing each piece under his guidance. Fear still lingered in their expressions, but it no longer held control. The work became an anchor for their minds, grounding them in purposeful motion. Within a short span, the bridge extended several meters over the canyon. The structure swayed lightly with the wind, but the main line remained taut. Alex tested each section by pressing his weight against the branches, evaluating the tension and listening for signs of strain. Nothing cracked. Nothing loosened. He straightened and announced that the time had come to take the bridge to the opposite ridge. Silence fell over the squad. Sareth looked at the incomplete span of the bridge with her mouth slightly parted. She knew what Alex intended, yet she could not stop the instinctive question that rose in her throat. She asked whether he was certain the structure could hold his weight. Alex nodded calmly. He explained that the primary vine line could support far more than a single person, and that the reinforcing vines added earlier would distribute the load evenly. His voice carried no bravado, only quiet certainty. Sareth felt her resolve strengthen, though her heart still raced with fear. Without further delay, Alex stepped onto the first branch. The bridge dipped slightly under his weight but stabilized immediately. He took another step, gripping the rope line with both hands. The wood groaned softly, adjusting to the motion. Behind him, the cadets watched with eyes wide and breath held in fragile suspense. The wind surged upward in a sudden burst, making the ropes sway. Sareth nearly reached forward to catch him, even though he was too far to reach. Alex lowered his center of gravity and pressed his weight into the ropes, waiting for the gust to pass before continuing. The bridge creaked under the strain but held firm. Step by step, Alex made his way across. The canyon below remained invisible beneath swirling dust, its depth impossible to comprehend, but Alex did not look down. His gaze remained locked on the outcrop ahead. Each movement was deliberate, each pause calculated. When he reached the midpoint, the wind struck harder, rocking the entire structure. Vera cried out and stepped back instinctively. Sareth clenched her fists, silently begging the bridge to hold. Alex braced himself and lowered his body until his chest nearly touched the branch, reducing his wind exposure. The gust passed again, leaving the bridge swaying gently. Alex resumed walking. When he finally reached the opposite ridge, he crouched and wrapped the rope around the protruding stone with practiced efficiency. His hands moved quickly, forming the same reinforced knot he had tied earlier. Once secure, he gave the line a sharp pull. The rope resonated with a deep vibration, signaling strength. Sareth exhaled in relief, her knees momentarily weak. Lauren let out a nervous laugh. Vera covered her mouth, struggling to steady her breathing. Alex raised a hand, signaling that the first phase was complete. Sareth approached the beginning of the bridge with slow, hesitant steps. Alex called out instructions on how to balance her weight, how to move with the sway rather than against it, how to grip the rope without freezing her muscles. His voice reached her through the wind, steady and clear. She inhaled sharply and placed her foot on the first branch. The bridge dipped, but Alex reassured her. She tightened her grip and took another step. Her heart pounded violently, but she refused to back down. She crossed as slowly as her nerves demanded, each step a battle against instinct, each breath a deliberate effort to keep moving forward. When the wind struck again, her legs buckled, but she forced herself upright, guided by Alex's calm direction. Lauren followed next, shaking visibly but determined. Shira crossed with rigid posture, refusing to look at the canyon even once. Vera stepped onto the bridge with trembling hands, but walked more steadily than she expected, her trust in Alex overshadowing her instinctive fear of fissures. One by one, the cadets crossed the canyon. Each arrival on the opposite ridge strengthened the structure's proven reliability. Each crossing chipped away at the fear that had nearly paralyzed the squad earlier. By the time the final cadet stepped onto solid ground, the group stood in stunned silence, staring back at the bridge that now connected two impossible sides. Alex walked to the front of the group, his expression unchanged, but his voice held a quiet satisfaction when he told them that the bridge would hold long enough for sunset completion. The cadets looked at him not with disbelief or fear, but with respect they had never felt so deeply before. The squad stood on the far side of the canyon in a silence that felt heavier than the wind that swept across the ridge. The rope bridge still swayed gently behind them, the vines creaking under the fading sunlight. Sareth turned toward it, unable to fully grasp how something so simple and so fragile-looking had carried her squad to safety. Her pulse slowly returned to normal, and for the first time since reaching the canyon, she felt the ground beneath her feet as something steady rather than threatening. She exhaled with a trembling relief she had not allowed herself earlier. Alex remained at the front of the group, studying the terrain that stretched ahead. The path winded through jagged formations and finally dipped into a descending slope that led toward the rendezvous point marked on the squad's map. The trial required them to reach that point by sunset, and the sun was already brushing against the horizon. Its orange glow lit the rocky surface with warm hues that contrasted sharply with the cold tension that had filled the squad moments ago. Sareth approached Alex slowly. She hesitated, unsure how to address him now. Her earlier doubts, her fear, her instinctive panic, everything seemed distant compared to the quiet certainty he had demonstrated. She finally thanked him, her voice low but sincere. Alex nodded as though the gratitude was expected but unnecessary. He replied that the squad had crossed because each cadet had found the courage to step forward, not because of anything he alone had done. Sareth wanted to argue, to insist that his presence had changed everything, but the words tangled in her chest and never reached her lips. Behind her, Lauren examined the ridge with renewed confidence. His earlier terror still lived somewhere inside him, but it no longer guided his actions. He walked closer to the cliff and looked back at the expanse the squad had crossed. He whispered a quiet disbelief, not directed at anyone but himself. His shoulders straightened a little more with each breath. Shira and Vera gathered near him, both stunned by how different the world looked now that fear no longer blurred their perception. Alex gestured for the cadets to follow him. The path ahead was uneven but accessible. The squad fell into formation without needing to discuss it, their steps aligning naturally behind him. Sareth watched how easily the group synced with his pace. She realized that a shift had occurred within the squad, not in their formal hierarchy, but in their understanding of leadership. The canyon had fractured them, but the crossing had reshaped them, binding the group in a way she could not have accomplished through commands or discipline alone. As they descended along the rocky slope, the wind softened and the air grew warmer. The sound of distant mineral geysers echoed faintly from the valley ahead. The squad walked faster, their bodies adjusting to the more forgiving terrain. Vera walked beside Shira, recounting the terror she had felt and how she had almost refused to cross at all. Shira listened quietly, nodding, her analytical facade stripped away to reveal genuine respect. Lauren followed behind them, repeating Alex's instructions under his breath, as if memorizing each detail for future trials. Sareth moved closer to Alex again. She watched how he observed every shift in the environment with unwavering attention. She asked him how he remained calm when fear nearly overwhelmed everyone else. Alex took a moment before answering. He told her that fear was never the enemy. The real danger came when fear dictated decisions. He explained that he had learned long ago to treat fear as information, something to examine, something to respect, but never something to obey blindly. Sareth absorbed his words with a gravity she rarely felt during training. She understood suddenly why humans were spoken of with so much caution and fascination across the galaxy. The squad reached the final descent leading to the rendezvous point. At the bottom of the slope, a flat plateau extended outward, marked by the tall signal pillar that instructors used to track squad arrivals. The pillar glowed faintly with embedded circuitry, a stark contrast to the raw wilderness surrounding it. The cadets approached it with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. When they stepped into the designated zone, the pillar emitted a sharp tone that signaled completion of the trial. A few seconds later, two instructors emerged from behind a cluster of rocks. The instructors expected a fractured squad, perhaps even a partially failed one. Instead, they found a united group walking with firm steps, led by a human cadet whose boots were still covered in vine fibers and canyon dust. One instructor looked past them toward the ridge and froze when he spotted the rope bridge. The structure clung to the cliffs like some improvised creation born of desperation and audacity. He had expected attempts using vines or stone wedges, but he had not imagined something so complete, or so functional. Sareth stepped forward to report completion of the mission. She described the obstacles, the canyon, the lack of equipment, and the time constraints. But when she reached the part about the bridge, her voice paused. She glanced at Alex briefly, then continued with a steadiness that surprised even her. She explained how he had built the structure, how he had anchored it, how he had crossed first, and how the squad had followed him across. The instructors exchanged glances, one of them lifting his brow in a rare expression of surprise. The older instructor finally responded, acknowledging the squad's performance with a firm nod. He praised Sareth for maintaining order under stress, but his attention shifted quickly to Alex. He asked him how he had known the vines would hold, or how he had trusted his own constructions enough to risk crossing first. Alex answered simply, he trusted the process because the environment provided enough signs to calculate the risks. He added that hesitation would have been more dangerous than attempting the crossing. The instructor considered his answer carefully, then nodded with an approving gravity. When the formal assessment ended, the squad settled on the plateau to rest while the instructors documented their results. The sun dipped fully behind the ridge, stretching long shadows across the valley. The temperature cooled, but the squad remained warm from the exertion, the adrenaline, and the sense of shared accomplishment. Vera sat beside Lauren, recounting her first steps onto the bridge, her voice shaking with leftover nerves but also quiet pride. Shira listened while sketching a diagram of the bridge in the dirt, studying its structure to understand how it had held so effectively. Sareth moved to stand near Alex once more. She watched him examine the distant canyon, perhaps replaying the crossing in his mind, but offering no verbal reflection. She asked him something she had never asked another cadet, whether he believed the squad could have succeeded without him. He turned his head slightly, the shadows softening his expression. He answered with an honesty that left her silent. He said the squad could have found a way, but not the same way. Each species approached challenges differently. His method had worked because he understood the materials and trusted his instincts. But the squad's survival had depended on the moment each cadet chose to move forward despite fear. Sareth absorbed his words, realizing that he did not see himself as the hero of the moment. He saw the team as participants in a process that required every individual to push against instinct. This realization struck her deeper than she expected. It reshaped her perception of leadership, of cooperation, and of the strange yet undeniable resilience of humans. As the last traces of sunlight disappeared, the instructors signaled the squad to prepare for return transport. The cadets rose slowly, their bodies tired but their minds sharpened by the trial. Sareth took one last look at the canyon, the rope bridge barely visible from the plateau. It stood as a quiet testament to what the squad had survived. She felt a swell of gratitude, pride, and something else, something shaped by Alex's calm presence and the unwavering logic he carried. When the transport beacon activated, Alex stepped beside the squad, ready to depart. Sareth met his gaze and nodded with a respect that carried far more weight than any formal commendation. He returned the nod with a small, measured motion. As the squad vanished in a shimmer of transport light, the last thought Sareth carried was the realization that the trial had not been designed to break them. It had been designed to reveal what each cadet brought into the unknown. And in that canyon, suspended between fear and survival, Alex had revealed the quiet, powerful truth behind why humans were trusted in the harshest corners of the galaxy. Not because of strength, but because of the instinct to build a path where no obvious path existed. The trial ended, but the lesson remained, etched into the minds of